Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Janice. Let me get my screen sharing going here. Okay, well, thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak here today. What I would like to do in my talk is give a bit of an overview into my lab's research over the last number of years, where we've been using drones to monitor forest change, and in particular focusing on a relatively dry forest landscape where we might expect to see particularly pronounced impacts of climate change. As I get started with this talk, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of the many students who have been involved in this work over the years. Several graduate students, undergraduate field assistants, international interns, whose contributions have really been instrumental to making this data possible. And so I'd like to just start off by thanking them and appreciating all the work that they've done. Now, many of you will be familiar with this curve. This is the Keeling curve that shows a documented increase in atmospheric CO2 concentrations as measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii from 1958 up till the present. The pattern that we see is a steady increase in atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and this is leading to an enhancement of the greenhouse gas effect, which is the main cause of anthropogenic climate change. The most damaging impact of that, of course, is a pronounced increase in the Earth's surface temperature over at least the rest of the 21st century. Now, we know that CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere, but it's worth taking a look at exactly where that increase in CO2 comes from. About 90% of the anthropogenic CO2 emissions come from burning of coal, oil, and natural gas. Another 10% comes from deforestation, primarily in tropical regions, as forests are converted to other types of land use. Now, that is what is responsible for the increase in CO2 over the last half century. But it's important to realize that only about 50% of the CO2 that's emitted to the atmosphere actually stays there. The other half is absorbed by carbon sinks, both in terrestrial ecosystems and oceanic ecosystems. So photosynthesis carried out by trees, plants, phytoplankton actively removes CO2 from the atmosphere. CO2 is also dissolved in the surface waters of oceans. And these two sinks are really important in limiting the rate of CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere and slowing the pace of climate change. Now, the terrestrial carbon sink accounts for a little more CO2 removal than the oceanic sink. A big part of this comes from forest ecosystems. So we tend to think of tropical forests in particular as being kind of major sites of CO2 sequestration. And that's true. More than half of the global forest carbon sink is in tropical forests, but the remainder does occur in temperate and boreal regions. And so really it's forests around the world that have a big role in actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere and preventing the accumulation of CO2 from being greater than it is. Now, given the importance of this forest carbon sink, it's important to try and understand exactly what's going to happen to it in the future. Is it going to stay the same? Is it going to get stronger, or where might it start to weaken? Well, there's both good and bad news on this front. So there are several reasons to expect that in the future, the forest carbon sink will become stronger as a result of increased tree growth, enhanced productivity, and additional carbon being stored within these ecosystems. So one reason for this is the potential that increased CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere can serve as a source of fertilizer to plants. This is one of the compounds that is used in photosynthesis, and with greater amounts of CO2, we might expect plants to carry out photosynthesis faster. It's also expected that increasing CO2 concentrations would increase water use efficiency for plants. So with more CO2 in the atmosphere, plants don't need to open their stomata as much in order to allow it to enter their leaves. This means that less water is going to be lost through the stomata and evaporated to the atmosphere. And so that means that in water-limited regions, we might expect that productivity could be increased because of that increase in water use efficiency. The other possible impact of climate change is that in temperate and boreal regions, we should expect to see longer growing seasons. So Trees might have opportunity for additional growth in the spring and the fall, and this could lead to an increase in annual rates of productivity, and again, more carbon being removed from the atmosphere. Now, on the other side of the ledger, of course, is that it is expected that climate change will lead to an increase in carbon turnover rates as a result of greater rates of tree mortality, and that this is going to release more carbon back to the atmosphere. So in the last couple of decades, it's been shown in many forest regions across the world that heat and moisture stress on trees is increasing. This is leading to enhanced rates of forest dieback. The photo that I've shown here is from the Aspen Parkland region in Western Canada. That region experienced a major drought in 2001 and 2002, which resulted in widespread mortality of trembling aspen. So this is a type of event that can release a lot of carbon back to the atmosphere. With warmer temperatures, it's expected that more water will evaporate from the land surface, and so we should expect to see increases in the frequency and severity of drought, even if there were no change in rates of precipitation. Warmer temperatures are likely also associated with an increase in insect outbreaks. So pests such as the mountain pine beetle are limited by cold winter temperatures. And if the winters are not as cold as they have been in the past, this could mean that those populations are no longer held in check, and we could see more insect outbreaks. And of course, warmer and drier conditions are associated with greater fire activity. So we should expect to see an increase in the annual area burned, again, releasing a lot of carbon back to the atmosphere. Now, each of these processes is relatively difficult to model, so it's hard to get very good predictions on exactly how much additional mortality we're likely to see in the future, or whether that is going to lead to an increase or decrease in the strength of the carbon sink when it's combined with potential increases in productivity. Now, taking a more regional perspective, one of the major environmental constraints on the distribution of vegetation in Western Canada is moisture availability. So this can be measured using what's called a climate moisture index. It's essentially a difference between annual precipitation and potential evapotranspiration. And the interesting thing about it is that it tracks really well with the distribution of vegetation in Western Canada. So areas where that climate moisture index is negative, that is, there's more potential evapotranspiration than precipitation, correspond to prairie and aspen parkland regions. So these are areas colored in yellow, orange, and red on these maps. Areas where the climate moisture index is positive, that is, there's more precipitation than potential evapotranspiration, tend to support continuous forest covers. So this is the areas in green and blue, representing the boreal forest to the north and the boreal cordillera to the west. Now, since the distribution of these different ecozones corresponds so closely to moisture availability, it's important to understand exactly what is going to happen with climate change in the future. And there's a range of scenarios that have been modeled. In the best case scenario, modeled by the IPCC, we might not expect to see too much of a change in the climate moisture index and the transition from prairie to forest biomes in Western Canada. Now, it's very unlikely that we're going to see this scenario come to pass. It would require immediate ramping down of our CO2 emissions, and we're not really on track to see that type of change in our fossil fuel emissions. And so we should look towards some of the other scenarios that imply much larger changes in moisture availability in Western Canada. In the worst case scenario modeled by the IPCC, we could expect that negative climate moisture index values would extend right across Alberta and Saskatchewan into the Northwest Territories, as well as large parts of northern Manitoba. Now, these are conditions that are associated with prairie and aspen parkland vegetation at the moment, and so in the future, we could expect that this would lead to a major change in the distribution of forests in Western Canada. And this, of course, would be very bad because it would result in the release of large amounts of carbon back to the atmosphere as a result of that change in vegetation distributions. I can also point out that under this scenario, that 2001 drought that I showed on the previous slide, it was one of the worst droughts on record, but that would basically be an average year in the later decades of the 21st century under that worst case scenario. So this all indicates that it's important to really understand exactly how moisture availability controls the distribution of different vegetation types and the dynamics of trees and forests in this region. Now, there's not that many places where you can find extensive forest landscapes in the Canadian prairies, but one such area is Cypress Hills Interprovincial Park, which is situated on the southern Alberta-Saskatchewan border. So this is an oblique image looking kind of northwest across the park's landscape. And you can see here that there is kind of a plateau on the right side of this image and a valley running through the center. So there's an elevation difference of about 200 meters from the top of that plateau to the valley. Now that might not seem like a lot, but as far as Saskatchewan is concerned, that is kind of a major amount of topographic relief. And what's interesting about it is that it is associated with changes in moisture availability. The valley is a lot wetter than the plateau. And so we can look at how that environmental gradient translates to changes in the performance of different tree species that are found within the park. Now, Cypress Hills is also an interesting landscape because there's really three major tree species that we need to focus on. White spruce, which is found kind of in the moisture areas in the valley bottom. Trembling aspen, which is found kind of at mid-slope positions and in amesic soils. And lodgepole pine, which is associated with drier soils near the top of the plateau. And interestingly, this is the easternmost population of lodgepole pine. It's normally associated with areas in the Rocky Mountains further to the west. And so my research program in Cypress Hills has been using variation in moisture availability to examine its role in influencing trees and forests across this landscape. So the photo shown in the top right of this slide gives a bit of a sense of what this landscape looks like. We see a mix of forest and grassland ecosystems. In the foreground, there's kind of a creek with a population of white spruce along its banks. Further towards the background, you see increasing amounts of trembling aspen, and up towards the top of the plateau in the background, we would expect to see lodgepole pine stands. And so my research team has established a network of 50 sites across the plot that range in elevation and are approximately equally distributed between the three major tree species. We have then been using annual surveys, primarily with drones, in order to monitor changes in these sites since 2015. And so the way that this works is that we would send a drone up on a pre-programmed flight path across each of these sites. They would fly a series of parallel flight lines, and with a downward facing camera mounted on the drone, take a photo every 1 to 2 seconds. And we can use the differences in the positions of these sequence of photos in order to use what's called a structure from motion algorithm to reconstruct kind of a bird's eye view of the forest canopy as seen from above. So when we do that, we get what's called an orthophotograph. For this particular site, here's what it would look like. And as you can see, it gives a lot of detail into the location of individual tree crowns. You can see many logs that have fallen over. In this case, there's a creek that runs through the center of the site. So we're really getting high resolution, detailed information on the canopy structure of each of these sites. And we're able to look at a series of photos from one year to the next to see how that canopy has changed. Now, in addition to this orthophoto, we also get three-dimensional information on the structure of these sites. So a point cloud representing the height of individual pixels in space. We can use that information in order to really visualize individual tree crowns and apply what is called a segmentation algorithm to isolate individual trees across this site. So here, individual tree crowns are just colored in with random colors. And this gives us really detailed information on hundreds of trees that are found across this site. So we have data on their height, we have data on the crown area, we can identify their species, we can tell which trees are alive and dead, and we can look at how these things have changed from one year to the next over the last 6 years or so. And so I've just produced a few examples of some of the changes that we have observed across these sites. So this is an aspen stand as it appeared in 2017. It looks fairly typical in this particular year, but if we skip forward a couple years, we see that there was kind of a localized blowdown event at this particular area. This is the type of thing that can be really hard to capture with kind of ground-based sampling approaches. Blowdown tends to be very patchy, very localized, and it's hard to sample a large enough area through traditional methods in order to kind of characterize how frequent it is across a given landscape. But these drone images do provide us with enough of an area to kind of characterize these types of patchy disturbance events. Here's another example of an aspen stand as it appeared in 2016. We can see what looked to be a number of dead aspen crowns in the upper right and bottom left parts of this image. If we fast forward a couple years, though, we see that those trees, most of them were not in fact dead at all. They had simply been defoliated, most likely from forest tent caterpillar. But rather than assuming that they're dead, with repeated sampling over time, we can see that they have been able to recover from that particular disturbance, and for the most part are doing okay a couple years afterwards. In addition to collecting red, green, blue imagery for these sites, we've also sampled these stands with multispectral imagery. So this is one particular site with a true color image on the left and a false color image showing reflectance in the near infrared and red edge parts of the spectrum here. The interesting thing about this is that multispectral imagery can be good for detecting trees that are either dying or are under some type of stress. So in the true color image on the left, we can highlight some of the dead tree crowns that are present here. They are indicated by black ellipses and circles. If we look at the corresponding parts of the infrared image, though, we see that those trees essentially disappear into the background. Dead trees absorb light in the infrared range, and so they basically kind of blend in with the ground vegetation here. And so it was expected that we might be able to use this multispectral imagery in order to identify which trees are under stress, which ones are most likely to die over the coming year. And so last summer, I had an undergraduate student working with me, and he developed a model that sought to predict which trees would die as a function of their a series of spectral indices, both for visible spectrum and multispectral bands. And so the top row of images here shows kind of a gradient of tree crowns from one on the left that is healthy and very likely to survive to the next year, across to one on the right side that has a lot of exposed branches, a lot of defoliation, and has only about a 50-50 chance of surviving until the next year. Now, the model that this is based on is primarily based on indices that reflect the amount of greenness in each tree's crown. So as you see more kind of exposed branches, more kind of defoliation, that is associated with a higher probability of mortality. If we look at the infrared images in the bottom row, though, we don't see very much of a change in their reflectance in the infrared band. So all of these tree crowns have about the same reflectance, at least for the live parts of their crowns. The dead branches, again, they kind of blend in with the background, but this doesn't seem to provide as much information that can be used for predicting mortality events. This multispectral data did contribute a little bit to the classification success of the model, but not as much as was expected. We found that most of the information on whether a tree was likely to die or not really came from the greenness and indices based around kind of the green band of the images. We've also been doing some work using thermal imagery across these sites. So here's one area on the left, again, showing a true color image, and on the right, showing a false color thermal image for the site. We can see that at the time this image was taken, the tree crowns were warmer than the ground vegetation. And this particular image was taken in the morning because you can see that the east side of the tree crowns are warmer than the west side of the tree crowns. And so the idea was that we could use this thermal imagery in order to kind of look at things like moisture stress and transpiration from tree crowns. I do have a student who's working on this now, but her results aren't quite ready to present. So I've just kind of given kind of a quick highlight of one thing that we've looked at, which is changes in canopy temperatures over the course of a day. So these 3 panels show the same site taken in the morning, at midday, and later in the evening. In both the morning and the evening, the tree crowns were warmer than the ground layer, but at midday, that situation was reversed, and the crowns were cooler than the sun-exposed parts of the ground vegetation. This is because at midday, trees were actively carrying out photosynthesis. They were transpiring water onto leaf surfaces, and as that water evaporated, it produced a cooling effect, which means that the temperature of the tree canopies was a few degrees cooler than the air and a few degrees cooler than the ground vegetation. So this just gives kind of, a quick taste of one of the things that we can look at using this type of thermal imagery and gain some insights into effects of potential moisture stress if trees were not actively carrying out photosynthesis due to dry soil conditions. So I've given kind of a couple quick vignettes as to some of the data that we've been collecting, some of the things we've been looking at using this drone imagery. But for the rest of this talk, I wanted to focus in a little more depth on 2 particular research questions. The first of which is asking, is growth more susceptible to local competition in areas where there is low soil moisture? So what does it mean to say that trees are experiencing competition? Well, trees, like other plants, require light, they require water, and they require nutrients. And their ability to acquire these resources does depend on the local neighborhood in which they find themselves. So here is an image of one of our sites here, and I'm just going to take away the ground layer from it, replace it with white and transparent colors so that we can focus more easily on individual tree crowns here. And I'd like you to focus in particular on these 2 crowns, one at the top of the image and one at the bottom. The tree at the top is situated in the middle of a gap, and so it's going to have light reaching it from at least 3 sides. Whereas the tree crown on the bottom is growing in a denser neighborhood. It's got trees growing on all sides, and so it would likely only be receiving light directly from above. And so what we wanted to do was develop a measure of neighborhood competition based on the canopy structures surrounding these individual tree crowns. And so the way we did that is that we defined a circle with a 15-meter radius around each individual tree's crown. We then used the canopy height model for each of our sites in order to calculate the average canopy height surrounding individual tree crowns. And so for the tree on the top here, which is growing in the middle of a gap, its neighborhood canopy height would be about 6 meters, whereas for the tree at the bottom that's growing as part of kind of a continuous canopy, it would have a neighborhood canopy height of about 14 meters. So the next thing we wanted to do with this was relate neighborhood competition to tree growth rates. So I had a master's student working on a dendrochronology project a few years ago. She scored a couple hundred trees across the park, and we used the width of the most recent growth rings in order to calculate an average growth rate for each of these trees over the past 5 years. And we wanted to relate that to the intensity of competition as measured by this neighborhood canopy height metric. And so this is the results that we got looking at white spruce and lodgepole pine. So on these plots, the x-axis represent the tree's diameter, the y-axis represents their annual radial growth rate. The black line represents trees that are surrounded by a shorter canopy, and the red and blue lines represent trees that are surrounded by a taller canopy and are presumably subject to greater amounts of competition for light. What we found was that for both spruce and pine, the small trees that were surrounded by shorter canopies had a faster growth rate than small trees that were surrounded by a taller canopy. However, that effect of competition was limited to the smaller trees. We did not see any effect of mean canopy height on the taller trees. So once a tree reaches 40, 50, 60 centimeters in DPH, it's well into the canopy, and it is no longer subject to the effects of competition in the same way that smaller trees are. The other thing we noticed from these results is that there is a pronounced difference in how susceptible spruce and pine are to competition. So lodgepole pine is a shade intolerant species, and we see that it expresses a much greater reduction in growth when it is growing beneath a taller canopy. White spruce is much more shade tolerant. It does still show a reduction in growth, but not nearly as large as what we see for lodgepole pine. The other thing we looked at was whether these effects of competition interacted with soil moisture at all. And we find that there were indeed some interesting interactions for both species here. Looking at white spruce to start with, it was able to grow relatively well if it was either growing beneath a shorter canopy, so less neighborhood competition, or it was growing in sites that had higher levels of soil moisture. The only time in which it really expressed a large reduction in growth was when it was faced with a combination of both intense competition for light, so a taller canopy, and low levels of soil moisture. Okay, so if it had access to either light or water, it would do fairly well, but if neither of those resources were readily available to it, then it would respond by growing much more slowly. Lodgepole pine also showed an interaction between light and soil moisture, but it was a little bit different. In its case, it would grow quite well if it had access to both lots of light as a result of growing under a shorter canopy and high levels of soil moisture. If it had either high competition for light or less access to soil moisture, either of those conditions would be associated with a strong reduction in growth. So for pine, it really requires both light and water in order to grow well. For spruce, it seems to do well if it has just one of those two resources. Now, the second question I want to cover in my talk today is related to tree mortality rates. And given that we're working in an area that's within the Canadian prairies, and we see relatively dry conditions compared to forests in other parts of Canada, we wanted to ask whether there has been a relationship between tree mortality rates and dry conditions that have been found in summers for the past few years. This is the summer precipitation records for the town of Maple Creek, Saskatchewan. It is about 50 kilometers outside of the park and is the closest location where we have kind of long-term weather station records. Here, the green dash line represents mean summer precipitation, and the blue line represents the running 5-year mean summer precipitation rates. Now, if you look at the right side of this chart, you see that the bar corresponding to 2017 is colored in red. That was the driest summer on record for Maple Creek and presumably the Cypress Hills as well over the past 100 years. So I did have a field crew out that summer, and they faced all kinds of restrictions because there was concern over forest fire hazards. They could only work at certain times of day. They couldn't take their trucks to certain places. And so it really was kind of very dry, and there was kind of concern for the potential of a fire in this area. Now, summers have been a little bit wetter in the 4 years since then, but they've still all been below the long-term average. And as a result of that, the 5-year average summer precipitation rate is currently the lowest it has been over at least the past 100 years. And so we're seeing an abnormally dry period for one of the driest forest landscapes in Canada. And that naturally leads us to the question, if we are going to see effects of drought, if we're going to see effects of increasing aridity on forest in Canada, this is the type of place where, and the type of conditions where we would expect those types of changes to be observed. So what we needed to do then was calculate the average mortality rate across each of the 50 sites that we've been monitoring. So the way we do that would be to identify each of the individual tree crowns from our canopy images. In this case, I've got all of the tree crowns that were alive in the first year, 2016, marked in yellow here. We can then look at each year's the changes that occur from one year to the next and count the number of trees that have died in either a standing or a fallen position. So in 2017, the following year, for this site, there was 1 tree that died standing and 8 trees that had fallen over. The year after that, 10 trees had died standing, another 5 had fallen over. And we can continue these measurements, across successive years in order to calculate an annual mortality rate, both in a standing and fallen position for each year and for each of our sites. That then allows us to look at whether there has been a trend in mortality over time. So this is the graph showing annual fallen mortality for each of the 3 tree species. There's not much of an overall trend, but the one thing that we do notice was that in 2018, white spruce had a notable uptick in its fallen mortality rate. And so this suggested that maybe there was a storm or some type of blowdown event that could have resulted in a lot of white spruce being blown over. If that was the case, we might expect that a lot of this mortality could have been concentrated in a couple of sites that were, in one local area of the park here. And so I mapped the fallen spruce mortality rate for that year. And I'm not quite sure whether this provides good evidence that it was a result of an individual storm or not. We do see that there were 3 sites that had the highest fallen mortality rate, all of which were kind of close to one another, but they were also surrounded by sites that didn't see as much of a fallen mortality rate. And so I'm not sure whether that's sufficient evidence to conclude that there was a storm that could have been responsible for this increase in fallen tree mortality. We did have a weather station that was right in the middle of those 3 large circles there, but unfortunately its battery happened to be dead in this year, and so we weren't able to get wind speed measurements that we might have been able to use to relate that fallen mortality to a particular weather event. Turning now to look at rates of standing tree mortality, here we do see that in the last year or 2, there has been a notable uptick in the rate of standing mortality for each of the 3 tree species in the study area. So both lodgepole pine, trembling aspen, and white spruce have higher mortality rates in 2018 and 2019 that they did in earlier years. And if we were to see some sort of effect of drought, some sort of effect of lack of soil moisture, this is the type of thing that we might expect to find. Now, in particular, since we are looking at a relatively dry landscape, we might expect that a lot of this increase in standing mortality rates may be concentrated in the drier sites within the park. And so here I'm showing how the fallen mortality rate in 2 periods, 2016 to 18, and the more recent dry period of 2019 to 2020, how those mortality rates have been related to soil moisture. And there is a bit of a trend for mortality to increase in some of the wetter sites, but it's not particularly pronounced, and there's not much of a difference between the earlier and later periods. If we turn to look at standing mortality, however, here we see that the picture is quite different. We do note that there is a strong increase in standing mortality in more recent years, but what is perhaps surprising is that most of that increase in standing mortality rate has been observed in the wetter sites on the landscape. The increase in mortality rates in the drier sites has been much lower than it has been in wetter parts of our network of sites. And so this is perhaps a bit surprising, but I think it can be explained by a hypothesis that is succinctly described as live fast and die young. So across both animal and plant species, we do see a trade-off between an organism's longevity and its metabolic rate, essentially. So the graph in the upper left shows this trade-off for different mammal species. So you've got species like whales who can live for many decades, but whose hearts only beat 10 or 20 times per minute. And that can be contrasted with species like shrews, which can have heart rates that are in excess of 800 beats per minute, but which only live for maybe a year or so. The faster an organism's metabolic rate, the more kind of amped up it is, that translates into a shorter lifespan across mammals. And the same is true for trees. The graph in the lower right shows the relationship between tree age and early growth rate for black spruce in Quebec. This is based on a database of tree cores. The red line here shows a model that was fit to the upper edge of that cloud of points, and it clearly shows that there is a decrease in tree longevity with early growth rates. So trees that are growing in more stressful environments where they have a lower growth rate can live for 150, 200, 250 years. But trees that are growing in a more productive environment where they have faster growth, they don't live nearly as long, maybe only 50 or 75 years. And so there is this trade-off between how fast a tree can grow, the environment that it's found in, and how long it can be expected to survive. And I think this explains why we're seeing the increase in mortality in the wetter sites across this landscape. These would be sites where trees are able to take advantage of good conditions when they're present. They're able to realize a fast rate of growth, but when conditions become a little bit more adverse, you have a series of summers with below average precipitation, they're not able to cope with those adverse conditions as well as trees that are growing in drier parts of the landscape and that are perhaps better adapted to a more regular lack of soil moisture. Okay, so I'd just like to leave you with a couple take-home messages from my talk today. The first of which is that this drone imagery, I believe, really provides us with some outstanding data on tree canopies, which we can use to understand the structure and dynamics of forests. I looked at visible imagery, multispectral imagery, thermal imagery, and tried to show how this can be used in different ways in order to understand how forests are responding to their local environmental conditions. I looked at the relationship between growth rates and competition and soil moisture, and we found that there was an interaction where the combination of high competition for light as well as low soil moisture was particularly damaging and led to a pronounced decrease in growth rates, both for white spruce and for lodgepole pine. Finally, I looked at how mortality rates have changed in response to an increasing drying trend over the last 5 or 6 years. And we found that there has been a doubling of standing mortality rates for different tree species, but that these increases in mortality have been concentrated within the wetter areas of my landscape. And trees that were growing in drier parts of the landscape have been a little more robust to the dry conditions that have been present for the last few years. So I'd just like to finish off by thanking my funders for their contributions to this research, and I would be happy to take any questions that people have.
Thank you, Mark. That was a great talk and very informative. Do we have any questions? Don't think I see any here. Maybe I'll kick things off here. I guess a burning question I have is whether or not there was an examination of the root ball of the fallen over spruce trees for biotic factors such as tomentosis root disease.
No, we haven't kind of ground truth a lot of that mortality. We have kind of been in the sites and kind of anecdotally just noticed that there have been a number of trees that were blown over, but we haven't done any investigation into specific pathogens that could have been involved in that as well.
Right.
No.
Do we have any questions from the floor? Brian, do you see anything? Because I want to make sure that I'm not missing anything on my screen here.
No, I've been keeping an eye on the chat and I don't see anything in the chat either.
Okay, well, I guess that that there are no other questions. A lot of information to take in. There's been so much work on drones these days and a lot of very interesting topics, and certainly some of which we can consider for forest health monitoring at a smaller scale, obviously. Anyway, I would like to thank you today, Mark, for your presentation. And I'd like to remind everybody about next week's webinar, where we will hear from 2 guest speakers from the USDA, providing an overview of Forest Health Remote Sensing Technical Working Group and efforts by the US Forest Service to improve forest health detection monitoring efforts. They've been very successful in getting some remote sensing work together as a result of COVID, ironically. So it'll be interesting to hear what they have to say next week. So once again, thank you everyone for participating, and thank you, Mark.